In this video, I'd like us to take a look at using that shader as if we were now a look development artist. We were setting up the properties of that material, of that shader, for use in rendering. So we're no longer dealing with the internals of the shader, but rather how an end user would use that shader, would create texture maps for use within that shader to generate this visual end result. And we're going to be looking at three different types of surfaces. We're going to be looking at a rubber surface for the tire of a wheel. We'll look at a metallic surface for this rim of the wheel, and we'll look at a fake car paint surface for this portion of a fuel tank. I do want to point out, obviously there is another object in our scene. This is a simple sphere with our HDRI material applied, and it simply has 100% reflections. And the reason for this is just to give us a lighting reference so we can see how the orientation of the lighting in our scene corresponds to our other objects. So I'd like to start out and just look at the underlying geometry that is driving this render. Then we can take a look at the materials that are applied to that geometry, along with the texture maps that those materials are using. And then we can take a look at the render passes that were generated to create this final composite. So I'm going to jump over to our scene view, and here is our geometry. And we'll see that we really have two main pieces of geometry. We have the fuel tank, and we have the wheel. We also have our lighting reference, and again we've already discussed that. We also have an interesting piece of geometry that we don't actually see in our final render. We have a ground plane, and this ground plane is not something that we should visually see in our final render, but it was rather something that I created in the scene so that we could shadow the underside of our objects, because without this we really didn't get a strong sense of realism. We really didn't get the sense that this wheel was sitting on something. It really just looked like it was floating in air, and since we had no background reference, we had no idea of what this wheel was supposed to be sitting on, no shadows on that surface. I wanted to sort of ground this render a little bit more, and to do that I put a ground plane that was shadowing our other objects. To set up this sort of scenario where the ground plane isn't visible in the render but does shadow for our occlusion passes is actually very simple. What we've done, we created a Vex Matte shader and we assigned that to the ground plane, and with the default settings the Vex Matte shader won't be visible in renders, but what it will do, it will give us occlusion. It will be visible when we're doing ray tracing, such that the surface will occlude for our ambient occlusion and it will occlude for our reflection occlusion. And that's very useful to us because it gives us this sense of shadowing on the underside of the objects. So now we can take a look at the two main objects, and you can see that their geometry really is quite simple. We've got the fuel tank. It's basically just a smoothed polygonal surface. And then we've got the wheel, and the wheel consists, as I deselect, there we go. The wheel consists of polygonal geometry for the tire, and there are quite a number of details in the geometry itself, but the vast majority of what we're getting is in terms of texture. So we do have the details of the tread in the geometry, but everything else that we're seeing in our final render, all of the mud splatters, all of these side detailings are all from our shader, all from our material. And then we have the rim, and that's just a simple NURB surface where we had a profile curve that was constructed, and that was revolved through 360 degrees. So there's nothing too complicated or too unusual going on with our geometry. It's just standard geometry, NURBs in one case, polygons in the other two, but it's just standard geometry. So now that we've seen the geometry, let's look at the three materials we've assigned, one for the tire, one for the rim, and one for the fuel tank. So I'm going to switch over to our shading context. And let's take a look first at our tire. So here is the material, and that is assigned to our tire. And the material for the tire is really interesting because we know, if we jump over to our composite view, we're dealing with a rubber surface type. So this rubber really needs to have a strong proportion of its final contributions coming from diffuse, because rubber is a very diffuse surface. It's a very rough surface. It scatters a lot of light that hits it. And we can see, if we were to look at our reflections tab, we can see that whilst we're mapping with a texture our reflection amount, we're scaling that really low to 0.2. So we have a very low proportion of reflections, and we have a very large proportion of diffuse. The color of our surface for diffuse is driven by a texture map. We can take a look at that texture map in a second. And the proportion of diffuse to reflections is driven by a texture map, and we'll look at the significance of that in a second as well. Interestingly, we're dealing with very blurry reflections, and this makes sense. We've said that most of our lighting is coming from diffuse, and therefore we're saying it's a very rough surface. It's scattering a lot of the light that's hitting it. That means that for any reflections that we get back off of our surface, they would be heavily scattered as well. So we do have a low reflection component, and that reflection component needs to be heavily blurred to give us this sense of a very rough, very rubbery surface. You can also see that we're dealing with some Fresnel, and that was just giving very nice visual qualities that I felt matched the tire material that I was trying to represent. This was a real-world tire that it was based on, and I felt that when we started bringing in a little bit of Fresnel, and that does have a index of refraction that matches plastics, when we started bringing in a little bit of Fresnel, we were dealing with a material that behaved more closely to rubber, especially as the fact that the wheel that I was matching had a slightly damp tire, so it had a layer of water on the top, and that really did feel like it was reflecting the light at glancing angles much more strongly than it was face on, but not quite as strong as a plastic material was, hence the fact that our influence is only 0.5. We're also dealing with displacement mapping, and that displacement mapping is simply adding some of these details to the side of our tire. So let's take a look at the diffuse texture and the reflection amount texture, because how these two textures correlate is really the key to how this tire material is working. So I'm going to jump over to Photoshop and let's load in our diffuse color. And our diffuse color is really, really simple. This is the diffuse surface color texture, and the vast majority of this texture is just a dark black color. Now it's very slightly off of black. I believe it's about a 30% gray, and it's a very dark color because our rubber really is a very dark material. It's a close to black material, the tire rubber. However, we wouldn't, if we just had black as our diffuse surface color, have a very realistic surface, because no surface is very clean, is very pure when we're dealing, especially with a wheel that's rolling over dirt, is rolling over mud. We're going to have a lot of other things that are affecting the diffuse color of that surface. In this case, dust and mud that has stuck to the surface of the tire. And if we don't include those in our texture, it's going to be very hard to get a realistic looking end result. So you can see that all around our tire, because the UVs of the tire pretty much lay the tire down this central portion of the texture, all around our tire we have mud, and we have more mud here on the outside of our tire where it would be rolling on the ground, and less mud on the edge of our tire as that mud would splatter up. And this was based on looking at a real tire that I was trying to match this tire to, and looking at how the patterns of mud on the surface of that tire were behaving, taking those ideas of the patterns of mud and applying them in this texture map. So we've got a diffuse color that ranges from black, where we have rubber, through to light browns where we have the strongest sense of mud. And that really is evident here in the render. We can see a lot of mud up here on the surface, and less mud down here, and then there's mud splatters on the side, and it's adding a lot of detail, a lot of realism into this render. Now the most important factor here is how this correlates to the reflection amount texture. If we load in the reflection amount texture, I think you'll see the correlation is incredibly strong. Because let's think about this for a second. Where we have rubber, we're going to have stronger reflections than where we have mud. And this makes sense. Here, where we have rubber, we've got a white color, and then the thicker the mud becomes, the darker this color becomes, because the less reflections we're having. And by combining these in this way, it means, and it's hard to see in a still image, but as this tire moves, as the reflections move over the surface, they're going to pick up on the rubber surface, and they're going to not pick up so much on the mud. And that's really going to give us a sense that we have this surface, and this surface has mud laying on the top, and the mud is dried on, it's dust, it's not wet mud, so it doesn't have a lot of reflections. And that really adds a sense of detail that break up the specular highlights as they move over the surface. It really works very nicely. It's also worth noting, and we did briefly cover this a second ago, look at the range of tone in this image. We are going from white all the way to black, because if I'm working as a texture artist, I really want to see the full range that I'm working with. If I was to deal with the true values that I needed, where even when we have white, we really only wanted around 0.2 of our reflections and the rest 0.8 to be diffuse, even then we'd have just 0.2 in our black. So we'd be going from black, 0, through to 0.2. This entire image on pretty much any monitor would just look black. So to be able to actually see how we're painting this texture, we've allowed this image to range from black all the way through to white, and then on the shader we've scaled this back down to a maximum value of 0.2, so that's very, very useful to us. Finally, we can take a look at this displacement map. It's a very small displacement, it's just adding some detailings on the side. If we take a look at the displacement, you'll see that we're just adding some lines down the side of our tyre. Those lines correspond to just around where the wheel rim is. There were some sort of bumped indentations. And then we have some text. All the white text is being pulled out of the tyre, and the black text is being pushed into the tyre. And again, these were based off of photo reference of the real world tyre that I was trying to match. So all of the text, all of the logos, and the positionings of the text around the wheel were all based at looking at real world reference. And that is the basis for creating that tyre material. There's really not much to it. It's a high diffuse contribution, a lower specular contribution, and more diffuse where we have mud, less reflections where we have mud, and then we have very blurry reflections wherever we do get reflections because of the fact that we're dealing with a rubber surface. A little bit of Fresnel added in there just to give us a nicer fall off of our reflections based on our viewing angle. So that's a look at our tyre material. Let's now take a look at the wheel rim material. And it's worth pointing out, again, this is based on a real-world tyre, and the real-world tyre for its rim had quite a rough metallic metal. It wasn't a highly polished chrome. It really did have a very rough surface, and that means despite being metal, so despite having quite a strong reflection component, it was a fairly rough surface, giving us very blurry reflections and giving us some sense of diffuse underlying as well. So let's take a look now. We can see we are texturing our diffuse, and we are texturing the reflection amount. We have a little bit of Fresnel, far less than we did with the rubber, and we have there our blurry reflections. So we can talk about the blurry reflections first, and that comes down to wanting to give this idea of this not being highly polished chrome, but rather this being a rougher metallic material. And I think it does a fairly good job of conveying that, because if we compare this material to our chrome sphere over here, we would instinctively believe this to be a highly polished mirror-like metal. It's a chrome metal, and we get the idea that this is still a metallic surface, but it's a much more rough metallic surface. The way the highlights are stretching out gives us a sense that this has been very rough. It's worn, it's maybe been machined, lots of little grooves in the surface, and that's giving us this rougher material. Again, this was based on trying to match this to photo reference. So here is our wheel rim, and we're dealing with blurry reflections. And you also notice our reflection color here is just pure white, because this is metal and it's not a colored metal, so we're having white reflections. It's worth pointing out, back on the tire again, we're dealing with white because we're dealing with a surface that really wasn't affecting the color of our reflections. But what's interesting is our diffuse map, and again our reflection amount texture. Both of those are going to have to correlate to allow for areas that should have more diffuse. There are obviously going to be areas that have maybe dirt and scratches and things in our diffuse texture. So I'm going to load in the diffuse color. And here we can see nothing special in the diffuse color. We're dealing with a sort of very muddy, very mossy green sort of metal with patches and speckles of mud and moss on that. The important thing is how this corresponds to the reflection amount. Again, a direct correlation here, where we have darker areas, where we have these muddy, mossy areas, we are having less reflections, because those areas aren't going to be as reflective as the metal material that's underneath them. So here we have a direct correlation between our reflection amount and our diffuse color, and again our reflection amount is making quite nice use of the fact that we can go all the way up to white, and then it's being slightly scaled down, giving us less of the reflections than we would get if we just used the full values of this image. A little bit of Fresnel, that's actually an interesting point, because really we know that metal surfaces just don't really have a real distinct difference between the glancing angles when we view them and straight on. They're very reflective at all angles. However, I found in this case, rather than thinking about it scientifically, thinking about it in a purely what is the visual end result manner, by increasing the Fresnel very, very slightly, I managed to bring out some of these highlights on the center portion of the rim, because this rim has sort of two grooves either side, then we have these points at the very edge of the rim that stick out, we go back into some grooves, and we have this center point. And on this center point, if we didn't have Fresnel, we'd really get a highlight all the way across here based on the shading. However, by bringing in Fresnel, just a little bit of Fresnel, I found that we could pull out some of the reflections at these straighter on, these more directly facing us surface normals, and bring out just some of the reflections that would run around the rim. And I felt that, especially in the project where this tire is being animated, it's moving around, we were getting much nicer sort of highlights. The reflection would suddenly sort of ping off of the surface, and it would roll and wrap around this surface and curve around this surface, and it would look a lot nicer, a lot more interesting. And at the end of the day, we are trying to produce something that visually is interesting. It stimulates the viewer visually, and I found that we were getting much nicer results by bringing in a little bit of Fresnel than we were by having a truly scientific metal where we wouldn't have any Fresnel influence. We don't have any displacement on this material, and that's simply because in the renders this particular portion of the object was far enough away that we really didn't see any of the displacement. Even the text on this tire was, in the end of the day, pretty small in our final project renders, but I've brought it back in for this render because it just adds a little bit of interest, and it shows working with displacement mapping. So we've now taken a look at the wheel. Let's now finally, in terms of materials and different surface types, take a look at this fuel tank. Now the fuel tank, it must be worth pointed out, is a fake car paint shader. Car paint, especially metallic car paint, has a number of properties that really do distinguish it as being a metallic car paint, because we have a clear coat over a sort of metallic flakes of color underneath, and that's going to give us different highlights. One highlight will be colored based on those flakes underneath, one highlight will be white based on the clear coat. We'd also, because of the way the clear coat works, we'd have to take into account Fresnel and the likes. Luckily, the fuel tank that I was matching on this project was fairly heavily diffused. It was very muddy, and it was very damaged, so it was very heavily diffused, and it was a black colour. Under the mud, it was actually a black colour, and that meant that the specular, or the reflections that we were getting on that surface, they weren't coloured, and that meant I could get away with having just a single white reflection, and that looked believable, as opposed to if we had a more modern metallic car paint, I wouldn't have been able to get away with this. This is rather than a modern metallic car paint, this was really just a more sort of old-fashioned paint. It wasn't metallic, and that meant that we didn't get those double specular highlights, double reflections, and we didn't get a sense of a colour in one of those reflections because we were dealing with just a black paint, and that really helped us out. The other thing I found, that whilst, yes, we did have a clear coat on the material, and whilst that should really have given us Fresnel influence reflections, I actually found that, let's just make sure we do select the fuel tank. I found that by not using Fresnel, I actually got a nicer visual result. And the reason for this was just, again, going back to what had the most impact visually, as opposed to what was necessarily the most realistic. Interestingly enough, for this particular object, I found that visually it had more interest when we got more reflections going on. If we started bringing in the Fresnel, we'd really ramp off our reflections. We wouldn't get anywhere near as much reflection on this surface. And I found that by dropping this Fresnel down and bringing back out those reflections, we got a lot more visual interest, especially when we start looking at the displacement mapping on this object, because the displacement mapping in this case was designed specifically for bringing out information in our reflections, and again we'll deal with that in a second. So it's worth pointing out we have a map, a texture map that's defining our diffuse surface, and we should be able to see this by now, especially as we compare it to the tire. We have black paint with a lot of mud on the top with some golden paint work on the top of that, so we do have quite a lot going on in our diffuse surface. We're texturing the reflection amount. Again, this should now become to be second nature. If we're having variations in our diffuse, chances are that's because we're dealing with dirt and mud. Again, important for adding visual interest and for adding details. Well, where we have mud, we're going to have less reflections than where we have paint, so we're probably going to need to texture that. And notice that even though this is a car paint, in quotes, material, we're dealing with a very muddy surface, and therefore I've scaled our reflection amount way down. It's actually a very low amount of reflections. This again was partly due to the fact that it's a very muddy surface and partly due to how I wanted the visual properties to be. We can see with strong reflections we're getting very bright, very white reflections coming from the very strong lighting here. By decreasing the reflection amount, we actually decrease the values on our reflection to the point where the blue colour of the sky started to come out. And I found visually this worked very nicely on our car paint. I really liked in the project how when the robot moved its arms, we'd pick up reflections rolling off of the car paint surface, and those reflections would have the colour of the sky in them. They'd have this blue running down to sort of an orange, running down to a yellow, and that's because we've dropped the reflections down to a point where we're getting these colours coming out of this otherwise overly bright area. And that's a combination of balancing the diffuse and the reflections, but so not to boost our diffuse too far, because if we really wanted to bring our reflections down, our diffuse would be too strong. I've also dropped the reflection colour down to further attenuate that. So again, it's all about, yes, there is a science behind why we've set up all of these parameters, and yes, you can go out and research materials and set them up very scientifically, but at the end of the day, it's a very visual medium that we're working in, and if something visually works, we are dealing really at the end of the day with an art form. If it visually works, there's no reason that these have to match science. So again, we're dealing with dropping the reflections down because I wanted to bring out the colour of the sky in the reflections, and I knew to do that I needed to get rid of these overly bright white areas and drop those down to the sort of bring out the sky colour. We can actually demonstrate, because this is an HDRI rendering. Here is that overly bright area. If I decrease the brightness down, we then bring out this really nice information about the colour of the sky, and I really wanted to see that in the reflections on our body paint. So that's a look at the parameters there. We do have a displacement map. It's a very small displacement map, but it's very useful to us. So let's now take a look at the textures that are driving that material. So we start out with our diffuse colour, and diffuse colour is fairly simple. It may look rather crazy. That's just due to the way the texture mapping works. There's an inside surface and an outside surface for an entire fuel tank. You have to recall that this is just a portion of the fuel tank, and the way I set this model up was that we had the entire fuel tank that was texture mapped, and then I chopped portions of that out to break it apart for the arms. And that's because in the project we have not only the broken apart portions of the fuel tank, but at the end of the project, when the transformation takes place, all of these portions had to come back together. So I actually textured it as a single object. But we can see if we were to look at just one portion of that object, we're dealing with the underlying paint being a sort of dark grey with mud on top of it. We have actually some rust patches on top of it, adding even more detail. And we have this golden paintwork, but this golden paintwork's faded, there's mud on the top. In fact, there's little areas that have flaked off, more so up here, and it's just trying to show the wear and tear. This was, again, it was a robot that was supposed to be an elderly robot. It was a classic motorcycle as opposed to a modern motorcycle, and I really wanted to get a sense of wear and tear. And to do that, we faded away some of the markings, peeled them off. It's got a lot of mud on the surface, and we've got a lot of rust patches on the surface as well. And we should see a direct correlation again between this and the reflection amount. So there's our reflection amount. Notice that where we have mud, we're having less reflections. Where we have rust patches, we're having even less reflections. And where we have paintwork, be that the black paintwork or the golden paintwork, we have full reflections, obviously then with mud layered on top of that. And this is probably one of the most interesting texture maps, because this really demonstrates why you need to think about how these texture maps are working and not just take your diffuse color and turn it into a grayscale image. Because if we turn this into a grayscale image, our gold would be a lot brighter than our background, our black. But notice in our specular, in our reflection amount, there's no differentiation between those two different colours, because the black paint or the golden paint has the same reflective properties. It's just as reflective as one another. It's the mud and the rust patches that are decreasing our reflections and bringing out the diffuse. And so it's those areas that are having darker areas in this particular texture map. Again, we scale this texture map way down. So it's being scaled way down, and that's giving us part of the idea that this is a very muddy surface, so we have a lot of diffuse, along with being able to show us the colours in our reflection, which I felt worked very nicely indeed. And then finally, and I think this is perhaps the most interesting portion of the material, although I do believe personally that this is my favourite material setup, just because of the way that it's kind of unorthodox in the way that everything's put together, but the final visual result I'm personally very happy with. We have a displacement map, and this displacement map is actually giving us these little bumps in our reflection, which when we're zoomed way in, they don't really work very well, but when we're zoomed out, it gives us this idea that there's little bumps in the paintwork. And this was true on the real motorcycle that this is based on. That motorcycle had little bumps, little air bubbles in the paintwork, and that gave us this sort of very rough reflection. So rather than having a very crisp, very smooth reflection, look at the way this reflection's working. The edges are very rough. There's speckles where we don't have reflection. There's speckles where we have stronger reflection. And that is the case all across this surface. This surface isn't perfectly smooth like our model would have us believe. This surface has a lot of intricate surface detail, little bubbles in the paintwork, the rust areas, they have sort of rusted through, and so they're actually down in the metal, they're a little bit displaced inwards, and we can see all of that in this image. We can see here are the rusty areas pushed into the image, and here's something that doesn't correlate at all to our diffuse or our reflection amount textures, a number of little white bumps. Those white bumps are going to displace out of the surface, a number of little white bumps. All of those white bumps are helping to give us all of this detailing, which really adds to the realism of this surface. We also can see that the Norton logo, that is the manufacturer of the motorcycle that this was based on, the Norton logo is also being displaced outwards, and that just is maybe not clear in this render. We could maybe just about see it here. It just means that occasionally when this would roll across, we'd pick out on the edges the Norton logo. Partly that just looked nice, but it's actually based off of the real world reference. The real world reference had this embossed text put on the outside for the logo, so this was slightly displaced from the surface. So hopefully by looking at these shaders and looking at the settings we've set for our material, looking at all the texture maps we've been using to drive the material, you can see that whilst the underlying shader is very scientific, very technical, at the end of the day we're dealing with something that's very artistic, and we do have a lot of artistic control over our final render. So it's all about looking at the real world. How is it behaving in the real world? What is the science making that behave that way? And then deciding, well, do we want it to behave the way that science tells us, or by tweaking science slightly, are we getting a nicer visual result? And the end result, hopefully you agree with me, is something that works very nicely visually, even though not all of the aspects, the car paint, for example, follows the ideas of the science of the underlying material fully. Our tyre does. The tyre is using blurred reflections because it's a more diffuse surface, and it's using Fresnel because it was a slightly damp and just a surface that just the properties of that surface gave us stronger glancing reflections. So we've taken quite a detailed look at the material settings, at the textures that were driving those materials. The last thing I'd like to do is take a look at our various render passes. So let's take a look at our 4 diffuse passes. We have the diffuse lighting, and we can see how this does correlate to the lighting we were seeing in that final render. A strong sense of lighting coming from one side, a strong sense of lighting from another side. And the diffuse lighting itself is actually attenuated towards the bottom, and that's not based on our ground plane. It's worth pointing that out. That's actually based, rather than the ground plane, that is based on the fact that our HDRI has a darker ground than it was on the sides. That's why the diffuse lighting's working in that way. We then have the diffuse surface color, which looks crazy on its own, but we can see that the two surfaces that had very muddy diffuse surface colors are very obvious. This other surface whose diffuse surface color was a sort of muddy green, or rather a mossy green on a metal, not quite as evident there in the texture, but it does actually come out quite nicely in the final result with how it was attenuating the reflections. We do have the ambient occlusion pass on its own, and the ambient occlusion pass is being affected by that ground plane and the fill light. And it's worth pointing out, well, actually I was a little inaccurate in my earlier description, so let me just backtrack. Our diffuse lighting, because our diffuse lighting is our ambient occlusion using the HDRI as opposed to our fill lighting that's using the HDRI. The diffuse lighting, because it's using ambient occlusion, is being occluded by that ground plane. So my apologies for the slight inaccuracy in my earlier explanation. This shadowing is because of the ground plane, because this is an ambient occlusion based pass. Just as the shadowing in this pass is affected by that ground plane. Our fill pass looks very bright. This is just the environment lookup, but if we were to decrease this, and this is what I'm getting at in this pass, we can see that the side does have brighter light than the underside, and that's just due to the nature of the way our HDRI was generated. Again, apologies for the slight inaccuracy. Hopefully everything is nice and clear now. But we can see that the fill pass on its own, the ambient occlusion pass on their own, they're not really defining our diffuse light. The diffuse light pass is working very nicely. But the reason we haven't used any ambient occlusion or fill to tweak this render is because I'm not matching this to anything. I don't have a background plate in this particular image, therefore I don't have any properties in terms of the shadows or in terms of the fill lighting that I need to match by bringing in either of those passes. So those passes have been excluded from this composite. But we do have the diffuse texture along with our lighting. They're being multiplied together to give us the final diffuse component. Again, this on its own is going to look rather strange, but it's only when we start combining this in with reflections and the reflection amount that we're going to get the nice end rendered result. So we can now take a look at our reflections, and these, I assure you, are going to look very crazy in their individual passes. So here's the reflections. Look how bright the reflections are, and that's just due to the nature of this is 100% reflections. We're not occluding anything, we're not balancing between reflections and diffuse, and especially on the surface of the tire where we've blurred those reflections right out, these are very, very strong. If we were to decrease the brightness on these, we can start to see something closer to the reflections we were getting on the tire and see that we only need 6% of our reflections to get something that's far more accurate to what we actually wanted. So there's our reflections. Here's our reflection occlusion. This is being very heavily affected by that ground plane. And that's very important because otherwise we'd be getting very bright, very strong reflections. And I wanted to ground our render, give it a sense of this sitting on a floor. And so I just put in that ground plane to sort of shade off the bottom, and also to demonstrate how we can have objects that add extra shadowing in without being visible in the render. So there's our reflection occlusion, there's our reflections, and when we multiply these together, already we get a stronger sense of realism, especially for these two objects on the right hand side. Our tire is still too strong. The rim of the wheel is getting some nice reflections going on there, but our tire is still way too strong. The surface color, interestingly enough, is white on our tire and our rim and on our lighting reference. And again, recall we only decreased the reflection surface color for our fuel tank, and the reason we decreased it for the fuel tank was to bring out some of those colored reflections. Notice we still have very bright reflections. We're now starting to bring out some of the colored reflections, and when we balance it with diffuse, that's when we bring out the colors in those reflections. And notice it's only when we balance our reflections and our diffuse together that we get anything that's vaguely realistic. If we were to look at the two components side by side, there is nothing realistic about either of those. We blend them together, And suddenly we're getting a much nicer end result. And we can look at how these are being balanced, and we can see quite clearly, well, here is our tyre with lots of diffuse, very little specular, and notice how we can see that all of our mud, how that's increasing the diffuse amount of our tyre. We can see that here our reflection reference, our lighting reference is just fully reflections. Here we can see where the mud is decreasing the reflections and our little rust patches are really decreasing the reflections on the fuel tank. And here's perhaps the most interesting portion. Remember when I was saying about how we used a little bit of Fresnel on the rim of our wheel to bring out those highlights? Just because I felt visually it worked very nicely when the wheel's rotating against the light. We can see that very clearly here. Notice how by using some Fresnel we get a stronger reflection down the center point, and these two areas are being attenuated based on the viewing angle. That takes our reflections from looking like this to looking like this, and just giving us this nice highlight that's coming out here, again sort of pinging off of the surface, if you will. And that's due to bringing just this strip down and taking out anything that would be on either side. The final node in the composite was just a brightness node to bring all of this out, and that was just so that things were a little clearer from the background.